Thank you so much. Okay. Well, I guess we are ready when you are, Mr. Justin. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to have everybody here. Thanks for joining us here in person, or if you're viewing us live on stream, or if you're viewing us after on a tape delayed basis. It's good to have you, and thanks for joining us. We've been studying the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, those tiny little books in the middle of the Old Testament. And the reason we've been doing that is that as we look at the stories in there, we look at uh, lessons in leadership. That there are things that we can take away from those stories and apply in terms of being good leaders here at Highland Village, here at wherever you may be worshiping, here in your workplace, or even in your family, or when whatever you're doing that requires some kind of a leadership aspect. We hope that you're enjoying that kind of perspective as we go through these books. We've just finished up our study of the book of Nehemiah, and we're moving on to the next book, the book of Esther. In terms of the order of the Old Testament, that's the next book. In terms of chronological order, not so much. Ezra and Nehemiah were pretty much chronological order. Esther, we're going to back up a little bit. We're going to go back a little bit earlier in time, probably about 100 years or so earlier. If you've been following us on the earlier books and you want some kind of perspective in terms of where Esther is placed, it would happen. What we're about to see here occurred somewhere between the book of Ezra, chapters 6 and 7. And to give you a better perspective, the exiles have returned to Judea and Jerusalem. The temple likely has been built. But this is still a period before Ezra the scribe travels down to Jerusalem to instruct and give training to the people of Judea. The Persian Empire is still pretty big stuff. In fact, the Persian Empire is at the peak of its power and its influence. It's the most powerful kingdom in the world. In fact, there really is no other kingdom around to compare to it. And it's in this setting that we can, because we talk about the idea of leaders and so forth, we've talked about mostly good leaders and held them up in our earlier studies. But if there are good leaders, there are also bad leaders, or to be generous to them, not so good leaders. And that may very well be with one of the characters that we see today and throughout our story of Esther, and that's a guy named Xerxes, who's better known as King Xerxes. He is the successor to the throne, to the Persian Empire. And his daddy, Darius, did a lot to build up the empire, make it what it is. And when daddy dies, the kingdom passes on to him. Now, if you've ever done any kind of study of leadership in terms of people who are families or dynasties or corporations and so forth, there's always there seems to be a pattern of there's this first generation that comes in, it builds the company, it builds the empire, it builds the dynasty, makes it what it is, and then they retire or they die, and the enterprise passes on to the next generation. It could be a son, could be a nephew, it could be other folks who were brought up in the enterprise, and they take over. And more often than not, that second generation is not quite as good in terms of leadership capabilities as was the first generation. Generally because they're a little bit spoiled with things. You know, and you really can't blame them to some degree. That's in terms of the way things are the world goes, the world is run, the way their enterprise is run. That's the only thing they've ever known. It's always been there. It's always been rich and powerful. And as far as they're concerned, that's the way it will always be. And with that kind of mindset, it's kind of easy to slip into a way of doing things that it doesn't necessarily work very well long term for that dynasty or that enterprise. And you see kind of that candidate here in King Xerxes. As I said, he inherited the kingship from his father Darius. He ruled for about two decades. And he was very fortunate that when he acquired the kingdom, it was at its height of power and expanse. The Persian Empire at that point covered all or part of what are today 12 modern-day countries. It spanned from Asia to Europe to Africa. It was quite an enterprise. And as far as King Xerxes was concerned, he figured himself to be a pretty good king. After all, look at how well things are running. One of the provinces in the empire was Egypt. And Egypt attempted to revolt and break away from the empire. Xerxes put them down. So he had one conquest or one suppression of a rebellion under his belt, feeling pretty good. Feeling so good that he was casting his eyes and see how he could grow the empire. He was looking at Greece. Well, Greece is out there having nothing better to do than just sit there. We might as well go invade it and conquer it and add it on in to the empire, and because it'll be good for us. We'll be expanding our footprint. Great idea. So an invasion of Greece was in the works. One thing before we go and we'll start our story of Esther, one thing I need to tell you about Xerxes, if you do any research on him, do any reading of his any biographies of him, the words foolish and arrogant bubble up to describe Xerxes. Those two particular words arise more than anything else in terms of describing who this guy was. So something to keep in mind, because it kind of will help inform you as to why certain things happen the way they do in our story. But if your Bible or your tablet or the other device is opened up to Esther chapter 1, we'll begin reading. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes, who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Cush, Cush being another name for Egypt. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. Now, keep in mind, I don't know how many of you all feel, how long can you stay away from your job? And, some folks will, well, I could go maybe 2 weeks, 1 month max, but we got to get back. Well, this guy is so confident about the way things are running that he takes essentially 6 months off from work to throw a party. In fact, he gives 3 feasts. The first one, verse 4, for a full 180 days, 6 months, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a second banquet, one lasting 7 days, in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people, from the least to the greatest, who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. It's interesting to read this description, because apparently in the original Hebrew translates to white stuff. you kind of get the sense that maybe the original draft of the story was written by a guy. You know how some folks, if women generally have an eye for the decor of a place, they'll say, "Oh, well, just look at, oh, it's so beautiful. This, it's everything was decorated in lavender, and you had lilacs, and and then lace curtain fillings and da 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 da, and they can, real detailed and what was in typical room. You put a guy in there, hey, what did the room look like? He'll say, well, they had some really comfortable couches in front of the flat screen TV. And, that's two different perspectives. So the original Hebrew here is white stuff. But we do get this detail of just how rich and how opulent the furnishings were in the king's palace and in the party that was going on here. Verse 7, wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. This detail basically tells you something about how generous and how unrestrained Xerxes was, because the custom of the day was, if you're invited to a party and you're served a goblet of wine, you were expected to drink that wine. You were expected to drink exactly what your host or the steward served you. If you refused to do it, you were then invited to leave. On this day, this particular feast, the king says, we're not going to worry about that. Let them drink whatever they want. So they do. And this little note here, there was a third feast. Verse 9, Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. That may have been part of the culture. The men party separate from the women. Maybe Queen Vashti knew what a week of drinking was going to look like and said, hey, gals, let's just go over here and, we'll be a little bit more discreet in what we want to do. So, verse 10, on the seventh day, after a week of celebrating, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, I think that's a nice way of saying the king was drunk. He commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, and I won't bother to read those names, but he commands his eunuchs to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. Well, gee, is that a problem here? Well, there is a problem. Verse 12, when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Well, gee, Queen Vashti, you're such an ingracious host. All he wants to do is introduce you to his attendants and his partiers. Well, maybe there's a little bit more involved in that, according to some of the traditions that are related to this story. When we read that Queen Vashti was to enter the arena wearing her crown, the expectation was that was the only thing she would be wearing. She basically would be not wearing anything else. Basically, King Xerxes was inaugurating basically a flesh parade at Vashti's expense. Vashti, to her credit, was having nothing of it, especially since basically the audience was going to be a bunch of drunken rowdies. Who would want to to face that kind of crowd, regardless of what you were or were not wearing? So Queen Vashti says, no, thank you. We'll just stay in our own separate part of the palace. Then the eunuchs come back, deliver the message to Xerxes, and he becomes furious, and he burns with anger. And, man, this is something we need to do about this. And, of course, keep in mind, Xerxes is not totally sober here. So that adds to the anger and the outrage, and I'm going to do something about this. This is intolerable. Verse 13, since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice. He spoke to the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king, another list of names I won't try to pronounce, but they were the 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? Xerxes asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. I think it's, to his credit, at least he's looking for some kind of advice, however misguided. One other little story about Xerxes that might be relevant here to give you an idea about his temper and his judgment. There was a story about him where his engineers, prior to a military campaign, built a bridge to cross the sea. Fortunately, there's this big storm that comes up. The storm washes out the bridge. Xerxes is upset. How upset? He orders the engineers to be executed. Well, that's a little rough. But, okay, if you're king, you can do that. But he doesn't stop there. He's not only mad at the engineers who built the bridge that didn't withstand the storm, he's also mad at the sea. So he commands his army to take chains and whips, and he orders the water to be whipped and chained to punish the sea. This is the kind of judgment and the mindset that you're dealing with King Xerxes. Not even when he's sober, he's probably not in the best judge of good measures to take. But anyway, he at some point he figures out, let's go to the experts here to see what I can do with Queen Vashti. And this is the response, verse 16. Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. They'll talk back to their husbands. They'll start spending money out of the bank accounts without permission. They might even start watching the Lifetime channel on TV. Our world as we know it will come to a sorry and terrible end unless you act, King Xerxes. Now, I'll leave it to your judgment. Was this really the end of the world just because Queen Vashti refused to honor a drunken request? We would say no. But this is kind of the culture and the mindset and the situation they're in. I'm sure part of the situation was guided by the fact that King Xerxes' personality and temperament preceded him. And so nobody wanted to say anything that would get them in Dutch with the king. So the wise man continues. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed. By the way, you might want to make a note of that, because that's going to play a key element as our story develops. Whenever the king passes a law, it becomes law. It is so permanent, there's just no way you can get around it. Cannot be repealed. So, let the king pass a law that says Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. That is some wonderfully stupid advice, man. Let me tell you. I don't think anyone at any time has ever been able to demand or coerce respect from anyone, least of all their wives or their husbands. We all know, or we've all been around the track long enough to realize that respect is something you don't order up, it's something you earn. Isn't that true? Good heavens! And you know, it's kind of a gross stupidity, you know, that kind of multiplies on itself. It's a bad version of symbiosis, where the outcome is the total outcome is worse than the really bad elements that come in, and create the situation. Well, no surprise. Verse 21, the king and his nobles were pleased with this advice. So the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his old household using his native tongue. Gee, problem solved. Aren't you glad? Aren't you glad Xerxes was in there? Because Dr. Phil wasn't around during that time. And people just didn't know how to treat their spouses properly. So thank you, King Xerxes. Well, on to chapter 2. Chapter 2 opens with the word later. How much later? The writer doesn't say, but scholars think chapter 2 opens about 4 years later. And during this time, Xerxes goes ahead with his planned invasion of Greece. Doesn't go very well. Greece basically responds by saying, thank you for visiting. Please come back and bring your vacation money, but please leave your army and your military machinery behind. If anything, the Persian groups get their collective rear ends kicked. It ends badly for Xerxes. He returns back to the empire with his tail between the legs, looking very, very embarrassed. Very much a defeated man, probably not looking very good in the eyes of the nation or in other leaders around the world, and he's probably not looking very good in his own eyes as well. Gee, I invaded Greece, and all I got was this stupid T-shirt, kind of thing. So spirits are low, and during all this time, apparently nothing has been done about Queen Vashti. At least, sure, she's been deposed, but apparently no plans have been made about a successor king. So, verse 2, the king's personal attendants come and make a proposal. When I read this, I kind of think that the personal attendants in this case was probably the king's PR team. Like, okay, we have an opportunity here to do something that will make the king and make us look good. So, king, we've got a plan that is nimble and robust, and we'll put you back on top and get you pick up at least 6 or 7 rating points on the Gallup poll. Here's their plan. Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. King, let's have a beauty contest. It'll be just like Miss America, only better, because the winning queen will be a real queen, and she'll be queen of a real kingdom. Well, this advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. According to the historian Josephus, how many women were involved in this? 400, according to his estimation. 400 women selected. These were the cream of the crop of beautiful women in the empire. And among those is verse 5, in the citadel of Susa, a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish. This Kish who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Keep in mind, this is why there's this Jewish population in the Persian Empire. They were sent into exile. And we've talked about the reasons for that exile in our other studies of the Old Testament. This was accomplished by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. We talked about how there are good leaders, and then the next generation of leaders not so good. This kind of happened with Nebuchadnezzar. He had a son who basically got invaded overnight and conquered by the Persians, which is why instead of the Babylonian Empire, you have the Persian Empire. And what subsequent events led to the Persian king allowing the Jews to begin returning to their homeland in Judea. Among those who didn't take the offer to return to Jerusalem, and that would have been basically that would have been a bold step to take if you were comfortable and settled into a land, even if it was a foreign land, because keep in mind, Judea is still considered at this time kind of a backward place, kind of a frontier, kind of what we would our equivalent of a Wild West town in Jerusalem. You just don't know what you're going to encounter if you go down there. Better to stay here in prosperous, cultivated Persia. And for whatever reason, Mordecai stays there. Well, Mordecai, verse 7, had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, her given Persian name, a name that meaning star, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. The Hebrew of this language says she was beautiful in form and lovely to look at. And given the fact that generally the Hebrew writers tended to be a little bit understated in their assessment of such things, Esther was a very, very, very beautiful woman. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. Something to keep in mind in this beauty contest. The participants were not necessarily volunteering to try out to be Queen of Persia. They got, in fact, if you literally followed the meaning of the text here, it wasn't Esther's choice to be in this contest. She got drafted. She got picked. Hey, you're going to try out to be Queen of Persia. And that's what happened. Verse 9, she pleased the eunuch Haggai and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Hey, pretty good out of a less than perfect situation. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. It's not really stated in Esther why Mordecai told her not to do this, but it's just kind of a given that you accept at face value. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Verse 12. Now, before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. Why 12 months? Well, probably so that the eunuchs could keep an eye on the women to check them out medically, because if any women were pregnant, they needed to be quietly excused. They wanted to avoid any kind of a scandalous situation where a member of the harem would come up and deliver a child that was not the king's own, which could have created all sorts of problems with heir to the throne and so forth. Another issue may have been that in that region, perfumes were very necessary because it's hot. And if you're hot in a region like that, you're hot and sweaty, and you probably don't smell your best. And so let's perfume these folks and just get them smelling good. make him more appealing to the king. And once that was done, verse 13 says she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, in the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Now, if this were a fairy tale, it would end here with the line, and they all lived happily ever after. Well, number one, life in a harem was not the dream that people really would want to aspire to. You know, the harem thing was kind of like a good news, bad news kind of joke. The good news is you've been selected to be the part of the king's harem. The bad news is you've been selected to be part of the king's harem. The good side of that was, hey, you were set for life, and you would live a pampered existence. You would not have to worry about where your next meal, or for that matter, your next beauty treatment was coming from. The bad thing was, it was the nicest kind of lifetime imprisonment that you could go into. It was like the Hotel California. You could check in, but you could never check out. Or like the Hotel California, you could check out, but you could never leave. There was no way you could resign from the harem. Once you were in, you were considered part of the king's property. And if the king decided he didn't like you, you didn't get to pack up and leave. You stayed there, but basically you were the equivalent of a widow. You couldn't see anyone else. You couldn't date anyone else. You basically were in that harem room for the rest of your life. And even being the queen, as we're going to find out, was not all that much more privileged, because there's not much that Esther, as queen, felt that she could do, because she couldn't make a move. She couldn't even really see the king unless she was summoned by him. So, number one, the harem thing, not an ideal existence for anyone. Secondly, our story continues. And to finish out chapter 2, verse 19, when the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, kind of implying that after she was made queen, she's able to secure for Mordecai something of a position of influence in the king's bureaucracy. But even so, verse 20, Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to, for she had continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. And then a little episode happens. Verse 21. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. Gee, even in the best of times, assassination is a constant threat if you're the king. And that's certainly the situation here. He's got two of his guards, two of his officers plotting against him. Mordecai, who is sitting at the king's gate, which is a way of saying that he really is in a position of power and influence, because at that day and time, the city gates were most of the civic and the governmental business got done. There were little pockets of areas where people would meet, and they would set up shops, or they would set up other tables or functions or to carry out governmental processes or businesses. So, and not only is Mordecai in one of the city gates, he's at the king's gate, which puts him in a position of power. He's there. He overhears the plot, verse 22, and he told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. Another important detail, because that will factor later on in our story. Verse 23, when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. That is a direct translation of what actually happened here. Your translation may read, they were hung on gallows. And when you read that, for those of us who grew up watching all these westerns, you have these images of, a scaffold, a noose, preacher reading the 23rd Psalm, and some grizzly-haired guy fixing to open the trap door. Nothing like that at all. The form of execution, when people were hung, basically they were literally impaled on a pointed stake. And that's as far as I'll go in describing the details. You can look it up. It's something you don't want to be reading or researching while you're during lunch. It's you'll lose your appetite. But it's death by gravity, unfortunately. It's grisly but true, and again, another factor that's going to come back and figure in our story. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So chapter 2 ends there, and we're going to end our study here. This is a good time to take a break and go back to our discussion of lessons in leadership. And the two elements of leadership that I'd like to look at and for you to think about are preparation and focus. Some of the things that we've talked about here. And as we mentioned, we've seen two contrasts in styles of leadership. Xerxes, king of Persia, the pampered guy who inherited everything that his daddy did. But there's another kind of leader, and that's Mordecai, who we generally probably wouldn't think of as a leader because he's not a commander of an army or the leader of a company or a country or whatever. But we can probably draw some leadership style issues from him as well. And the point of all this being that God can use people, whatever their leadership aptitudes, to carry out his will. One of the things to keep in mind in the book of Esther is that the things that are written down are not necessarily written to imply approval, that, this is the way you should do these things. Yes, carry out an edict to command your wife to respect your husband. It's kind of a matter of fact. Them's the facts. This is what happened. But even though these are not ideal situations, God can work through the details to get done what he wants to do. So with that in mind, a couple of questions to look at. What factors drive King Xerxes' leadership style, and what were the outcomes? And what factors drive Mordecai's leadership style, and what were the outcomes? Do you see Mordecai as a leader? Why or why not? Question number 2. Esther is enrolled in the empire-wide beauty contest and winds up being proclaimed queen. Nowhere is it stated that Esther entered the contest voluntarily. In fact, the story is written in a way that implies she may have been drafted. Do you see the hand of God at work in Esther's situation? Why or why not? As we saw in chapter 1, many times bad decisions are unforced errors, made entirely due to the person's poor judgment. When bad decisions are made, what are the proper steps to take to correct the situation? How do those steps you have identified compare with the actions King Xerxes takes in today's lesson? Question number 4. Several scriptures stress the need to be sober as part of our walk with God. Is being sober limited to your use of alcohol? In your opinion, in what ways would being sober have benefited King Xerxes? And the final question is, on what are you focusing your life in order to be open to following God's will? So, with those questions in mind, here's some scripture readings. If you haven't already, read the first 2 chapters of Esther. And then here's some scriptures to read while you're considering the issue of being prepared and focused. Joshua chapter 1, the first 9 verses. Matthew chapter 24, verses 36 through 51. Luke chapter 21, verses 34 to 36. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 and 16. And Revelation chapter 3, the first 3 verses. And then some scriptures on being sober. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 6 and 8. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 2 and 11. Titus chapter 1, verse 8, and chapter 2, verse 2, 4, and 6. And 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13, chapter 4, verse 7, and chapter 5, verse 8. Well, that's our lesson for this week. Next week, a villain arises and poses an existential threat to Esther and her people, forcing her to make a critical decision. What will she do? If you will, in preparation for that lesson next week, please read chapters 3 and 4 in the book of Esther. That's our lesson for this week. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next Sunday.